On a still, starlit night, the disciples gathered around the warmth of the fire, each carrying invisible wounds that weighed heavily on their souls. Little did they know that Jesus' gentle words would soon reveal the healing power they had longed for, the power of letting go. The evening was cool, with a gentle breeze coming off the sea, and the stars overhead blinked down like soft candle flames. The disciples sat around the fire, huddled close for warmth, yet despite their physical closeness, each of them was trapped in the isolation of their thoughts. As the fire crackled, the flickering light danced on their faces, revealing the tension etched deeply into their expressions. It had been a long day of travel, teaching, and healing, and although they had followed Jesus with unwavering devotion, each man was haunted by burdens he couldn't express. Peter sat apart from the group, his gaze fixed on the flames, watching as they flickered and swayed in the wind. Outwardly, Peter seemed strong, he always had. He was known for his boldness, his courage, his willingness to stand up when others faltered. Yet inside, Peter felt as if he were drowning in an ocean of anger and frustration. Lately, it seemed as though every little thing triggered him. The smallest disagreement with the others, the smallest challenge in their journey, and he could feel his blood boiling. He hated it, hated how out of control he felt at times. But more than that, he feared what his anger might say about him as a leader. Not far from Peter, John sat with his knees pulled up to his chest, staring at the ground. John had always been the gentle one, the disciple whose heart was full of love and compassion. But recently, John had been struggling with something he had never expected: sorrow. The weight of the world's suffering, the constant presence of sickness and death, had begun to sink into his soul like a stone. He found it harder and harder to maintain the light-hearted joy that had once defined him. Every time he looked into the eyes of someone they healed, he felt not only their relief but also the pain of all those they couldn't save. It was as if a dark cloud had settled over his heart, and no matter how much he prayed or how much faith he had, the sadness remained. Across the fire sat James and Andrew. Though the two brothers were close, tonight they barely spoke to one another. James, who had always been fiercely protective of the group, was struggling with guilt. His mind was filled with doubts. Doubts about himself, doubts about their mission, doubts about whether he was truly worthy to follow the Messiah. He had made mistakes along the way, spoken in haste, acted out of pride, and now, those mistakes weighed heavily on him. James believed he had to carry this guilt alone, that confessing it would make him appear weak in the eyes of the others. So he stayed silent, his heart growing heavier with each passing day. Andrew, meanwhile, was consumed by regret. His mind constantly replayed decisions he had made, paths he had chosen that he now questioned. If only I had done this, he would think. If only I had said that. Regret was like a chain wrapped around his heart, preventing him from fully embracing the present moment. Though he tried to hide it, Andrew was increasingly distant from the others, lost in his own thoughts, trapped in a past that no longer existed but still haunted him. Thomas sat off to the side, slightly apart from the group, his face reflecting the flickering firelight. Thomas had always been the rational one, the thinker, the one who asked the difficult questions. But lately, even his rational mind couldn't quiet the swirling storm of doubt within him. Doubt not only about their mission but about himself. Thomas had begun to wonder if he was strong enough, if he had enough faith to continue this journey. The uncertainty gnawed at him, and though he longed to speak his fears aloud, he didn't dare. Like the others, Thomas believed that showing weakness or doubt would make him unworthy in the eyes of Jesus and the group. In the midst of their silent turmoil, Jesus sat quietly, watching his beloved disciples with eyes full of compassion. He knew their hearts better than they knew themselves. He could see the invisible weight each one carried, the anger, the guilt, the sorrow, the doubt. He could feel their pain as if it were his own. But he also knew that this pain, these unspoken emotions, were not meant to be carried alone. The time had come for them to understand the truth, the deeper wisdom that would set them free. As the fire crackled softly in the silence of the night, Jesus spoke, his voice gentle yet filled with authority. "My friends, I see the burdens you carry," he began, his words washing over them like a cool breeze. "Each of you has been weighed down by emotions that feel too heavy to bear. But these emotions, this anger, this sorrow, this guilt, they are not your enemies. They are not weaknesses. They are signals calling you to a deeper understanding of yourselves." The disciples looked up, their attention drawn to Jesus' words. Though none of them had spoken their struggles aloud, it felt as if Jesus could see straight into their hearts, as if he had been walking beside them through every painful moment, every silent battle. Jesus continued, his voice filled with love and wisdom. "Let me tell you a story," he said softly. "There was once a man who lived in a small village by the sea. Every day this man carried a large jar on his shoulders. The jar was filled with water, and at first it was light. The man didn't mind carrying it, for he was strong, and he believed he could bear the weight without any trouble. But over time the jar grew heavier. The man didn't notice it at first, but with each passing day, the jar seemed to press down on him more and more. As Jesus spoke, the disciples were drawn into the story, each of them feeling as though they were the man carrying the jar. Peter's fists clenched as he thought of the anger he carried, anger that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. John's heart ached as he thought of the sorrow that had settled over him, weighing down his once light spirit. One day, Jesus continued, the man came upon a river. He was tired, more tired than he had ever been before. So he sat down by the river's edge and set the jar beside him. As he rested, he looked into the jar and was shocked by what he saw. The jar wasn't just filled with water, it was filled with stones. Small, heavy stones that had accumulated over time. Each stone represented an emotion he had been carrying: anger, fear, guilt, regret. Though the stones were small, together they made the jar unbearably heavy. The disciples exchanged glances. They understood the weight of those stones, the emotions they had been carrying in silence, the burdens that had grown heavier with each passing day. Jesus paused for a moment, letting his words sink in before he continued. The man didn't know what to do, he said. He had carried the jar for so long that it felt like a part of him. He didn't know how to live without it. But then an old man appeared by the river. The old man saw the heavy jar and said to the man, "Why do you carry these stones when they are not yours to bear?" The man, confused and ashamed, replied, "I cannot let them go. They have become a part of me." The old man smiled gently and said, "No, they are not a part of you. They are only stones. And stones can be set down." James, who had been silently weeping, wiped his tears away. He had been carrying guilt for so long that it felt like it had become a part of him. But now, hearing Jesus' story, he began to wonder if perhaps he could let go of that guilt. If perhaps the weight he carried was not his to bear alone. The man was afraid, Jesus said softly. He had carried the jar for so long that the idea of setting it down frightened him. He didn't know who he would be without it. But the old man said, "Place the jar in the river and watch what happens." The man hesitated, but finally he did as the old man instructed. He placed the jar in the river, and as he watched, the water began to flow over the stones. One by one, the stones were washed away, carried downstream by the current. The jar became lighter until eventually it was empty. For the first time in his life, the man felt free. The weight he had carried for so long was gone. Peter's heart beat faster as he listened. He could feel the anger he had been carrying, the frustration that had built up inside him, but now he began to understand that it wasn't his to carry alone. He didn't have to bear the weight of his emotions in silence. Jesus' voice grew even softer, more compassionate. "My dear friends, each of you carries a jar filled with stones. You carry anger, sorrow, guilt, regret, believing that you must bear these burdens in silence. But I tell you now, you do not. These emotions are not your enemies. They are simply stones, and stones can be set down." The disciples were silent, their hearts laid bare before their teacher. For the first time, they allowed themselves to truly feel the weight of the emotions they had been carrying. They realized that these emotions, these burdens, had been shaping their lives, influencing their actions, and yet they had never truly acknowledged them. Peter, his voice trembling, spoke up first. "Lord," he said quietly, "how do we let go of something we've carried for so long? I have carried this anger, this frustration for so long that it feels like it's a part of me. How do I set it down?" Jesus smiled gently, his eyes full of understanding. "You begin by acknowledging the weight," he said. "You name the stones for what they are. When anger rises, ask yourself what fear lies beneath it. When guilt weighs you down, ask yourself what wound it is protecting. These emotions are not your enemies. They are signals showing you where healing is needed. And once you understand them, you can choose to let them go. You do not have to carry them alone." Peter's heart softened. He could feel the anger inside him, but now for the first time he recognized it not as a sign of his failure, but as a cry for help. He realized that his anger was rooted in fear. Fear of failure, fear of not being good enough, fear of letting down those he loved. And in that moment, with Jesus' words ringing in his ears, Peter understood that he didn't have to carry that fear alone. James, his voice barely above a whisper, spoke next. "But Lord," he said, "what if the guilt is too heavy? What if it's too deep? I have made mistakes, and I don't know how to forgive myself." Jesus looked at James with love in his eyes. "Guilt, too, is a stone," he said gently. "It is not meant to be carried forever. Guilt shows you where you have strayed, but it is not meant to punish you. Once you understand its lesson, you can forgive yourself and let it go. You are not defined by your mistakes. You are defined by the love and grace that is always with you." Tears welled up in James' eyes as he listened. He had carried his guilt for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be free. But now, hearing Jesus' words, he felt a spark of hope. Perhaps he could forgive himself. Perhaps the weight he had carried for so long could finally be set down. One by one, the other disciples spoke, each of them confessing the burdens they had carried in silence. Thomas admitted his doubts, not only about the mission but about himself. Andrew confessed his regrets, the decisions he wished he could undo. And John, with tears streaming down his face, confessed the sorrow that had been slowly consuming him. Jesus listened to each of them with patience and love, offering words of wisdom and comfort. "You do not have to carry these burdens alone," he said to each of them. "You are not defined by your anger, your guilt, your fear, or your sorrow. These are simply stones, and stones can be set down. You are defined by the love and light within you, the love that I have for you, and the grace that is always with you." As the night deepened and the fire crackled softly, the disciples felt a profound sense of peace wash over them. They had always believed that strength meant bearing their burdens in silence, but now they understood that true strength came from acknowledging their emotions and sharing them with one another. Peter reached out and took John's hand, a silent gesture of solidarity. James, wiping away his tears, smiled softly at Andrew, who returned the gesture. They were no longer alone in their pain. They had each other, and they had the wisdom of Jesus to guide them. "Remember this, my friends," Jesus said in closing, "you are never alone in your struggles. I am with you always, and you have each other. When the weight feels too heavy, remember that you can set it down. You can share your burdens with those who love you, and together, you will find the strength to walk in peace." And in that moment, the disciples smiled, not just with their lips, but with their hearts. They felt lighter, freer, as if the invisible jars they had carried had been set down by the river of Jesus' love and wisdom. Their burdens had not disappeared, but they no longer felt as heavy. For the first time in a long while, they felt free, free to feel, free to let go, and free to walk the path ahead with open hearts. As the stars twinkled overhead and the fire slowly died down, the disciples remained by the fire, their hearts full of peace and their souls full of light. They were ready to face the journey ahead, not with the weight of their hidden wounds, but with the strength of love, understanding, and the power to let go. This is end of the story. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.